There's a particular kind of laughter that doesn't come from joy. It comes from fear wearing a costume. I didn't understand that the first autumn Cyrus Bell started stacking firewood inside the walls of his own house, not against them, not beside them, inside them, ripping out the drywall in his back rooms and packing the cavities with split oak like a man insulating against the end of the world. The whole valley laughed at him. I laughed at him. We called him the woodpecker. We bet on how long before his place burned to the ground or fell over from rot. But I want you to understand something before I tell you the rest, because it took me a whole winter and a dead man's silence to learn it myself. The people we mock the loudest are almost always the ones who saw something coming that we were too comfortable to look at. This is the story of an old man, a barn full of regret, and the longest cold I ever lived through. It's the story of how I stopped laughing. And if you've ever been the one everybody else thought was crazy, or if you've ever been part of the crowd doing the pointing, stay with me. Because by the end of this, you're going to feel the temperature drop. I promise you that. I keep a log, always have. My father did it, his father did it, and somewhere in a drawer I've got a leather-bound notebooks going back to 1961 with nothing in them but weather, calving dates, and the occasional bitter remark about my neighbors that I'd be embarrassed to read aloud. People think a rancher's life is all wide horizons and freedom. It isn't. It's arithmetic. It's writing down how much hay you put up against how many cold nights you expect, and praying the two numbers don't betray you in February. So when I tell you the morning it started, I can tell you exactly when. I wrote it down. October the 9th, first hard frost 3 weeks early, Bell tearing his house apart again. Damn fool. That's all I gave him at the time. 11 words in a slur. I'm not proud of it. The thing you have to know about Cyrus Bell is that he'd been the kind of man people don't look at twice for about 40 years. And then one autumn he became the kind of man people can't stop looking at. He lived at the dead end of Fenner Road, which is the road I live on too, half a mile down, so I had a front row seat to the whole spectacle whether I wanted one or not. His place was a low ranch house his late wife Margaret had kept beautiful, window boxes, a porch swing, the works, and after she passed, it had slowly gone the color of old teeth. Nobody blamed him. Grief does that to a house. We all figured he'd just fade out there quiet, the way the old ones do. Then in early October that year, I drove past and saw him standing in his front yard with a sledgehammer and a wheelbarrow full of broken plaster. He was 73 years old and swinging that hammer like he meant to teach the wall a lesson. I slowed the truck, rolled the window down. The air smelled like wood smoke and the particular metallic nothing that comes right before a freeze. "Cyrus," I called, "you all right?" He didn't even turn around. "Better than I'll be in January," he said and swung again. I drove on, wrote my 11 words, moved on with my life. But here's the thing about a small valley. There's no such thing as a private project. By the end of that first week, everybody on Fenner Road and half the people in town knew that old Bell had gutted the interior walls of his 3 back bedrooms and was stacking split firewood into the framing, cordwood packed tight between the studs, floor to ceiling, room after room. He'd left the front of the house alone, kitchen, living room, his own bedroom. But everything behind it, he was turning into a woodpile with a roof. People had theories. Dale Southers, who runs the feed store and has never in his life had a thought he didn't immediately share, decided Cyrus had gone senile. Margaret kept him glued together, Dale said, leaning on his counter while I bought mineral blocks. Now she's gone, he's coming apart at the seams, filling his walls with wood. You watch, next thing he'll be talking to it. The young guys thought it was hilarious, started calling him the woodpecker. Somebody, I never found out who, though I had my guesses, left a rubber chicken nailed to a fence post at the end of his drive with a sign that said free range. Cyrus took the chicken down, kept the sign. I saw it later, propped in his shed. I never asked why. And me, I want to be honest with you because this whole story is worth nothing if I'm not. I didn't think he was crazy. That would have let me off the hook too easy. What I thought was worse, in a way. I thought he was pathetic. I thought here was a man who'd lost his wife and his sense and was now wasting the last of his strength on a delusion, and I felt that comfortable, superior pity that lets you look down on somebody while telling yourself you're being kind. I'd nod at him from the truck. I'd say, "Morning, Cyrus," and I'd drive off shaking my head and feeling, God help me, a little better about my own life by comparison. That was October. The cold came down off the high country the way it always does, in stages, like a tide that doesn't go all the way back out between each wave. We'd had early frosts, then a stretch of false warmth, Indian summer, my mother used to call it, the year showing you one more pretty face before it turned mean. The aspens went gold and dropped. The geese left early. I noticed they left early. I wrote it down and didn't think hard enough about why. Cyrus kept working. That was the maddening part. A man with a foolish notion usually loses steam, the foolishness wears off or the labor does it for him. But Cyrus didn't lose steam. Every time I passed, he'd moved more wood. He had cords of it stacked in his yard, more arriving on a flatbed from a logging outfit 2 counties over, and he was processing it himself with a maul and wedges, splitting and stacking, his breath clouding in front of his face. For a 73-year-old man, it should have killed him. Instead, he seemed to be getting harder, the way a hickory handle gets harder the more you use it. One afternoon in late October, I finally stopped. I don't fully know why. Maybe the pity got too heavy to carry past him one more time without setting it down. I pulled into his drive, killed the engine, and walked up to where he was working. Up close, he looked terrible and wonderful at the same time. He'd lost weight he didn't have to lose. His hands were a wreck, split knuckles, a thumbnail gone black, but his eyes were clear in a way I hadn't seen since before Margaret got sick. Grief had been living in those eyes for 2 years. Now something else was in there with it. Purpose, maybe, or just the simple animal focus of a creature that has decided to survive. "You want coffee," he said, just like that. No surprise that I'd come, no defensiveness about the wood, like I'd been expected. We went inside, and that's when the laughing stopped being easy for me, though I didn't laugh anyway anymore by then. The front of the house was normal, sad, dusty, a widower's house, but you could feel the difference the moment you stepped past the kitchen. The air got still, dense, the way it does in a root cellar or a deep cave. He'd run a wood stove in the living room and the heat from it just sat there. Didn't leak away the way heat always leaks away in an old house, didn't get sucked out through cold walls and single-pane windows. It pooled. It held. I put my hand flat against the wall between the kitchen and the back bedrooms. It was warm, not stove warm, body warm, alive warm. "Oak's got an R value," Cyrus said, watching me. "Dead air between the splits, too. You stack it tight and stagger it, you've got better insulation than half the new houses they're throwing up out by the highway, and it does something fiberglass can't." He tapped the wall with one ruined knuckle. "It holds the heat and it holds the cold out. Margaret's people up in the North Country, the old ones, they used to do it. Pack the north walls of the cabin with cordwood every fall. Burn it down through the winter from the back rooms forward so the wall got thinner as the days got longer. By spring you'd burned your insulation and you didn't have to store it anymore." He almost smiled. "Smart. Nobody does it now. Nobody has to." "But you have to," I said. He looked at me a long moment. The clock on the wall, Margaret's clock, I'd bet money, ticked into the silence. "I think we're all going to have to," he said. I didn't ask him what he meant. I should have. I've thought about that a lot since. The number of times in a life that somebody tries to tell you something true and you let the moment slide past because asking would cost you something, your time, your comfort, your idea of yourself as the sensible one. I drank his coffee, which was terrible, and I made small talk about cattle prices, and I left. In my log that night I wrote, "Bell's house warm as a kept oven. Wall held heat strange. No real explanation. Cold front coming per radio." That's the closest I came, that whole autumn, to writing down the truth. That I'd felt something in that house I didn't understand, and instead of leaning in toward it, I'd backed away. The talk in town got crueler before it got kinder, which is the usual order of things. There was a meeting at the Grange Hall the first week of November, nominally about the road budget, but mostly about whatever everyone wanted it to be about, which is what those meetings always are. And somewhere between the snowplow contract and the question of the broken culvert on Route 6, Dale Southers brought up Cyrus. "I'm just saying," Dale said, in that voice men use when they're about to say something cruel and want cover for it. "Somebody ought to do a wellness check. Man's clearly not right. Filling a house with firewood, that's a fire hazard for one. Insurance won't cover it. And what happens when he falls and breaks a hip back there in his little wood maze and nobody finds him for a week?" There were murmurs. Some of them were the concerned kind. Most of them were the entertained kind. A house is theater when it belongs to somebody else. And here's where I have to confess the worst of it, the part I've never told anybody until now. They asked me, because I lived closest, because I'd been in the house. Linda Karchner, who ran the meeting, turned to me and said, "You've seen it. Is the old fellow okay?" And I had a chance right then to say what I'd felt. To say, actually, the strangest thing, his house was warmer than mine. He's not crazy. I think he might know something we don't. I had the truth sitting right there in my mouth, warm as that wall under my palm. And I swallowed it, because saying it would have meant standing alone in a room full of people who'd already decided, and I have never in my life been brave in a crowded room. What I said instead was, "He's getting on, probably ought to keep an eye on him." Neutral, safe. A small betrayal dressed up as concern. Linda nodded, satisfied. The meeting moved on to the culvert. I drove home that night and the temperature gauge on my dash dropped 4 degrees in the half hour it took to get from the Grange Hall to my gate. 4 degrees. In half an hour. I'd never seen it do that. The sky had that high, hard, starless look, the kind that makes the old-timers go quiet. I passed Cyrus's place and there was light in the kitchen window, warm and gold, and a thread of smoke going straight up from his chimney into the still air, dead straight, no wind to bend it. I told myself the cold snap would pass. They always pass. I was wrong about that the way I'd been wrong about everything else that autumn. The first real storm came on the night of November 14th. I know because, well, you know how I know. It didn't come like a normal storm. There was no front you could watch roll in, no wall of cloud, no smell of snow on a rising wind. It just arrived. The radio that evening had upgraded from cold snap to advisory to, by 9 o'clock, a kind of language I'd never heard the National Weather Service use about our valley. Words like historic and life-threatening and unprecedented decline. A mass of Arctic air had broken loose from someplace. It was never supposed to break loose from and come pouring down out of Canada like water out of a busted tank, and we were directly under it. By midnight my thermometer read 18 below. By 2 in the morning it read 31 below, and the wind had started, and with the wind chill the radio was saying 50 below, 60 in the gusts. Numbers that don't mean anything until you've stood in them. Numbers that turn the air itself into a thing that wants to kill you. I'd ranched my whole life. I knew cold, but I didn't know this. This was a different animal. I went out to check the stock with every layer I owned, and the cold reached through all of it in under a minute, found the gaps, the seams, the small mortal places, and started shutting me down from the outside in. My eyelashes froze together. The breath froze in my mustache and cracked when I moved my mouth. I got the cattle into the lower barn and the horses into the stalls, and I made it back to my house, and I shut the door and I leaned against it shaking, and that's when the power went out. It went out and it stayed out. The whole grid, the whole valley, the whole region. The lines couldn't take the load and the cold both, and somewhere a substation gave up. And just like that we were 200 souls scattered across 40 square miles of mountains with no electricity and the temperature still falling. I had a generator. A lot of us did. But I want you to understand how this cold worked, because none of us understood it that first night. My generator was a good one, diesel, well maintained. I'd run it 100 times. That night the diesel had gelled, turned to jelly in the lines from the cold, and it wouldn't start. My backup was a propane heater, and the propane regulator had frozen. Every system I had for surviving the cold had been designed by people who'd never imagined a cold like this. And one after another, they failed. I ended up in my living room at 4 in the morning with a wood stove I hadn't cleaned properly going into the season, burning through a woodpile I suddenly realized was about a third the size it should have been, because I'd done the arithmetic for a normal winter, and this was not going to be a normal winter. And I knew it the way you know a thing in your gut before your brain will let you say it. I sat there and I watched my own breath fog in my living room, inside, by the light of a stove that was losing the fight against walls that bled heat into the dark as fast as I could make it. And I thought about Cyrus Bell. I thought about his hand tapping that warm, dense wall. It holds the heat and it holds the cold out. I thought about the stillness in his back rooms, the way the warmth had pooled and held. I thought about the geese leaving early and the frost 3 weeks ahead of schedule, and a 73-year-old man splitting oak in the cold with clear eyes and split knuckles while the whole valley laughed. I think we're all going to have to. I'd been in that room. I'd felt it under my hand. I'd had the truth in my mouth, and I'd swallowed it to keep peace at a Grange Hall meeting. Out my window, half a mile down a road that was now a ribbon of black ice under a sky with no power line lit on it anywhere, there was the faintest glow. Steady. Gold. Cyrus's kitchen window. His chimney was smoking. Straight up. No wind could touch that smoke, not even this wind, because his house was built like a thing that meant to live. I sat in the cold and I started, finally, to understand. Not the science of it. The science came later, and it was sound, every bit of it. The old North Country people had known exactly what they were doing. What I understood that night was simpler and went deeper, and it has never fully let go of me since. I understood that I had laughed at a man for refusing to be comfortable. I understood that comfort had made fools of all of us, and that the most foolish of all had been the ones, like me, who'd felt the truth and chosen the crowd anyway. And I understood, watching that gold light hold steady against a dark that had swallowed everything else, that before this was over I was going to have to walk down that road and knock on that door, the door of the man I'd called pathetic, the man I'd half betrayed at a public meeting, and ask him, with my hat in my frozen hands, for help. I waited until the gray suggestion of dawn before I went, and I'm not proud of the reason. The reason was that I didn't want anyone to see me do it. Even with the power dead and the valley locked in a cold that was killing things, even with my own house failing around me, the small vain animal in me wanted to walk down that road unwitnessed, so that if the door opened on a senile old man and a fire hazard and nothing else, no one would ever know I'd gone. That's the kind of man I was at 38 below. I'd like to tell you the cold burned that out of me by the end. It mostly did. Mostly. Half a mile doesn't sound like anything. Half a mile in that cold was a journey to another country. I dressed in everything. 2 pairs of wool socks, my insulated bibs over long johns over a second pair of long johns, 3 shirts, my heaviest coat, a balaclava, a wool hat over that, the big chopper mitts with the liners. I looked like a man going to the moon, and the cold went through all of it like it was a rumor. The first breath outside my door punched into my lungs, and I felt the small hairs in my nose freeze and stick. The second breath I learned to take through the wool, slow, because a fast breath of air that cold does something to the inside of your chest that your body remembers as a warning forever after. The road was black ice under a skin of dry snow that squeaked, actually squeaked, a high tortured sound under my boots. There's a thing the old-timers say, that snow only squeaks like that below about 10 degrees, and the colder it gets the higher the pitch. The snow under my boots that morning was singing a note I'd never heard. The sky had cleared to that pitiless deep blue-black that means there's no cloud cover left to hold any warmth down, and the stars were still out, hard and close, and there was not one single sound in the whole world except my boots and my breath, and somewhere far off, a crack like a rifle shot that I knew was a tree, the sap frozen in the trunk, expanding, splitting the wood from the inside. The forest was breaking itself apart in the cold. I heard 4 of those shots on the walk down. 4 trees dying. I thought I might die too. I'll be honest about that. Somewhere around the halfway mark a kind of warmth started creeping up from my feet, a false, sweet, drowsy warmth, and a far-off part of my brain that had read the same survival pamphlets every rancher reads said, very calmly, "That's the hypothermia, that's the lie it tells you, keep moving." So I kept moving, toward the gold light. It was the only light in the valley, and it had not so much as flickered. His chimney smoke still went straight up. I made it to his porch, Margaret's porch, the swing furred white with frost, and I lifted my frozen mitt to knock, and the door opened before I touched it. Cyrus stood there in a flannel shirt, just a flannel shirt, no coat, no hat, like it was October. Behind him the house breathed out a wall of heat so thick and sudden that my frozen face screamed with it, that deep ache you get when blood comes back into a frostbitten thing. He looked at me for a second, took in the whole spectacle of me, the moon suit, the frost, the shaking. "Took you longer than I figured," he said, not unkind, just true, and he stepped back and let me in. "I want to tell you about the inside of that house, because I'd been in it before in October and felt the strangeness of it then. But October had been a preview. What I walked into that morning was the thing itself, fully realized, and it undid me. It was warm, not surviving warm, not better than outside warm. It was the warmth of a kitchen on a Sunday, the warmth of a childhood you half remember, a deep even heat with no cold corners and no draft and no edge to it anywhere. He had one wood stove going, a modest one, the firebox no bigger than a bread box, and it was throwing off a heat that my own roaring stove half a mile back couldn't have matched if I'd fed it a forest, because his heat had nowhere to go. The cordwood in the walls held it the way a thermos holds coffee. The cold that had walked through my house like it owned the place couldn't get a finger past those walls. I stood there dripping as the frost on me melted, and I started to shake harder, the real bone-deep shaking that comes when a body that's been holding itself rigid against the cold finally believes it's allowed to stop. Cyrus put me in a chair by the stove and put a tin cup of something hot in my hands, broth, beef broth. He'd been simmering a stock pot on the stove top for days. He told me, partly for food, and partly because the steam put moisture back in the air the dry cold sucked out, and he didn't say a word while I came back to life. He let me have my dignity in the only way that mattered, which was to not watch me lose it. When I could talk, the first thing I said was the thing I'd been carrying down that road, and I got it out before the cowardice could stop me again. "I'm sorry, Cyrus." He was at the stove, feeding it one split, careful, no waste. He didn't turn around. "For what?" "You know for what." My voice cracked and I let it. "For the Grange meeting, for all of it. For the chicken on your fence, I didn't do it, but I laughed when I heard, and that's the same thing. For calling you, I couldn't finish." "Pecker?" He said it for me, still didn't turn. Margaret would have liked that one. She had a sense of humor I never did. And then he did turn, and his clear eyes found mine, and there was no triumph in them, none, which somehow made it worse. "You didn't come down here at 38 below to apologize. A man doesn't risk his life to feel better about himself. You came because you're in trouble, so let's talk about the trouble and leave the rest. It doesn't matter now. None of it matters now. There's only the cold and what we do about it. There's only the cold and what we do about it. I have thought about that sentence more times than I can count. It is the whole of survival, distilled. It is the thing the comfortable can never understand, and the thing the desperate learn in a night. So we talked about the trouble. The trouble was bigger than me, and we both knew it before I said the names out loud. My generator was dead, and my propane was frozen, and my woodpile was a third too small, and I could solve some of that. I could move into 1 or 2 rooms, seal them off, burn smart. I'd survive. I'm hard and I'm stubborn and I had resources, but I wasn't the one I was afraid for. The Halloran kids, I said. Out on the Route 6 spur. Single mom, Becca, 3 little ones, the youngest is I don't know 2. They're all electric out there. New build, no wood stove, no chimney even. When the power went, I didn't have to finish. Cyrus's jaw worked. He knew the family. Everybody knew everybody. And the Petersons, I went on, because once I'd started nomming them I couldn't stop. The whole vulnerable map of the valley unrolling in my head. Old Gus is on oxygen, runs off a concentrator. The concentrator runs off the wall. His tank backup'll last him. What a day. And the Voss place, they've got that boy with the seizures. He's got to stay warm and regulated or... I stopped. Cyrus, the power's not coming back today. Maybe not this week. The radio said the whole grid's down across 3 counties, and the cold's not letting the crews work. People are going to die out here. People I've waved at my whole life are going to freeze to death in their own beds while I sit half a mile away in a chair, drinking your broth. The stove ticked. Margaret's clock ticked. Outside, another tree went off like a gunshot. Cyrus sat down across from me. For the first time since I'd known him, he looked his age, all 73 years of it landing at once, and under the age I saw the thing I'd missed for 2 years because I'd been too busy pitying him to look. I saw grief, not faded grief, fresh as the day it was born, the grief of a man who'd built a fortress against the cold 1 year too late to save the one person he'd have built it for. Margaret got pneumonia the winter before last, he said quietly. You remember, cold snap, not like this but cold. House couldn't hold the heat. She was always cold those last months, always asking me to bring another blanket, and I'd bring it and tell her to stop fussing. The house was plenty warm, I was warm. What was she on about? His hands, those ruined hands, lay open in his lap. She wasn't fussing. She was freezing to death by inches in a house I told her was warm, and I was too comfortable to feel what she felt. And by the time the pneumonia took hold, it was too late for the wood or the warmth or anything else. He looked at the wall, the warm, dense wall packed with oak. Her people knew how to do this. She'd told me over the years the way you half listen to a wife's stories about her grandmother. They packed the north walls every fall. I half listened. I let it go past me. Because I was comfortable, and asking would have cost me something. He looked back at me, and there it was, the recognition, the thing that made us not so different after all. You know that feeling. I know that feeling, I said. I built this after she was gone, he said. Every split of it. People think I went crazy with grief, and maybe I did. But it wasn't crazy. It was late. I built the thing that would have saved her, a year after it could have saved her, and I've been sitting in it warm and alone all autumn waiting for a winter cold enough to prove it worked. And now the winter's here, and the only person it can prove anything to is me. His voice didn't break. It just got very, very quiet. And now you're telling me there's children out on the Route 6 spur with no chimney. We looked at each other. And the morally heavy thing, the thing I'd been circling since I walked in, the thing that would either save people or kill us, sat down in the room with us and waited. Here is the decision, laid out plain the way it laid itself out for us that morning. Cyrus's house was the only warm structure for miles. Not just warmer, warm, truly warm, warm enough that frostbitten children could thaw out and sick old men could breathe and a 2-year-old could survive the night. But it was warm because of a balance, a thing Cyrus had engineered to the split. A small fire, a sealed house, the wood and the walls slowly being burned from the back rooms forward, exactly as Margaret's people had done it. The whole system depended on the house staying sealed. Every time you opened that front door, you bled out heat. It would take the little stove an hour to rebuild. Every body you brought in raised the demand on a wood supply Cyrus had calculated for one man through a normal winter. And this was not one man, and it was not a normal winter. If we opened the house to the valley, we'd be burning through the walls themselves, burning Cyrus's insulation, his cordwood, Margaret's memorial, the thing he'd built with his grief, far faster than he'd planned. With no certainty the power would come back before it ran out. We might pack the house with frightened, freezing neighbors, and then in a week, run out of wood and walls both, and have a house full of people and a fire going out and the cold still sitting on the valley like a stone. We might save everyone for a week, and then lose everyone in the 8th day. Or we might keep the house sealed and small and safe, save the 2 of us and maybe 1 or 2 others, and let the rest of the valley take its chances. And most of them would be fine. Most people are tougher and luckier than your fear says. And the Hallorans might make it to a neighbor's, and the crews might get the power up by tomorrow. And we'd have risked nothing and kept the fortress intact. And we'd find out in spring who hadn't made it, and we'd tell ourselves there was nothing we could have done. I want you to sit with that for a second because we had to. There was no clean answer. The pamphlets don't cover it. Open the door and maybe kill everyone with kindness. Keep it shut and maybe live with the arithmetic of who you let freeze. Margaret's clock ticked through the whole of it. Cyrus broke the silence. He'd already decided. I think he'd decided 2 years ago, in a sense, the first day he picked up the maul. He'd just been waiting for someone to come down the road and need it. It comes out of the walls, he said. All of it if it has to. Wood's no good to a dead man, and neither is a warm house with one old fool in it. He stood up, and the age fell off him again, that animal purpose coming back into his frame. But we do it smart or we kill everybody. We don't just open the door and let the heat run out. We bring people to the house and we keep it sealed between trips, and we burn the walls down in the right order, back to front, the way it's built to burn. And we don't have hours to talk about it. He was already pulling on coveralls. Your truck run. Diesel's gelled like everything. Mine's gas. Old gas don't gel. Of course it was. The old man who'd refused every modern convenience had the one vehicle that would start at 40 below. We start with the Hallorans. Children first. Always children first. And that was it. That was the whole moral mountain, and he walked over it in about 90 seconds, because to a man who'd already lost the one thing that mattered, the math wasn't hard. Everything was already lost once. Everything after that is just a chance to keep someone else's everything from being lost too. I stood up. My legs still didn't want me. Cyrus, if we do this, if we burn the walls, you don't get your spring. You don't get to sit in here and march warm and proven right with the wall burned thin and the days getting long. You burn it all at once for strangers, and you're left with a gutted house and no wood and a grief you built into a thing that's just gone. He stopped at the door, looked back at me, and he smiled, for real this time, the first real smile I'd seen on him in 2 years, and it was the saddest and most alive thing I ever saw on a human face. Son, he said, what in God's name did you think the wood was for? We brought the Hallorans in first. I won't tell that whole drive here. The spur road was worse than Fenner, drifted and glazed, and Cyrus's old truck slid twice toward the ditch, and twice he brought it back with a calm that came from not being afraid to die. But I'll tell you what we found, because I need you to understand the stakes weren't theoretical. We found the house dark. We found Becca Halloran in the front room with all 3 children in one bed under every blanket and coat and curtain in the house, and she was awake, had been awake for 2 days, keeping watch the way a mother does. And she was so cold she couldn't make her hands work the lock, and we had to break in. And the 2-year-old Cyrus got to the 2-year-old first, lifted that small bundle, and the baby was alive, was breathing, but it was the kind of cold that stopped crying. And anybody who's been around the very cold and the very young knows that a baby that stopped crying is a clock running down. We got them in the truck. We got them to the house. Cyrus carried that baby through his warm front door and into the heat, and he did something I'll never forget. He didn't put the child near the stove. He held it against his own bare chest under his shirt, skin to skin, the oldest warming there is. And he sat in the chair by the fire and held that thawing child, and I swear I saw him say something, soundless, just his lips moving. And I think it was a name, and I don't think it was the baby's. The baby started crying about 20 minutes later. I have never been so glad to hear a child scream. We went back out. Of course we went back out. We got Gus Peterson and his oxygen tanks. We got the Voss family and their boy. We got the Karchners. Yes, Linda, who'd run the meeting where I'd half betrayed the man whose chest was now keeping a stranger's baby alive. She came through that door not meeting my eyes and not meeting Cyrus's, and Cyrus handed her a cup of broth and said, "The back bedroom's warmest. Get warm," and that was the whole of it. That was his entire revenge. A cup of broth in a warm room, and I watched her start to cry into it, and I understood that the cold was burning something out of all of us, not just the heat from the walls. By that first night, there were 19 people in Cyrus Bell's house. By the second day, there were 26. And the wall in the farthest back bedroom, the one we burned from first, the way it was built to burn, was already 3 splits thinner than it had been at dawn. The radio said the cold would hold for 6 more days. We did the arithmetic that night, Cyrus and I, by the stove, low so the others wouldn't hear. We counted the splits in the walls. We counted the people and the days and the heat. We counted it twice because neither of us wanted to believe the number we got the first time. The number we got was that we did not have enough wall to last the cold. We were going to run out, somewhere around day 5, with the cold still on us and the power still down and 26 people in the house. Children, an old man on oxygen, a boy who couldn't be allowed to get cold, and a fire that was going to start dying right when they needed it most. Cyrus looked at the number a long time. Then he looked at me. And for the first time since I'd known him, the clear eyes weren't clear. There was something in them I hadn't seen, something I didn't want to see, because I'd come down that road believing this man had an answer for everything the cold could do. "There's one more thing we can burn," he said quietly. "But you're not going to like it. And I need to wait till morning to tell the others, because if I tell them tonight, half of them will try to stop me, and the other half will let me, and I don't know yet which half is right." Margaret's clock ticked. Outside, far off, another tree split open in the dark. He told them in the morning, the way he'd said he would, and he told it plain. By then the house had its own rhythm. 26 people learned fast how to live small. We'd worked out a system overnight, the sick and the old and the youngest in the back bedrooms, where the burning walls kept the air warmest, the able-bodied taking shifts at the stove and the door. A single rule that everyone learned in an hour and nobody broke. You do not open the front door unless a life depends on it, and you do not hold it open 1 second longer than that life requires. The door was the wound. Every time it opened, the house bled. We taped blankets into an airlock, a double curtain you passed through, so the cold couldn't get a straight shot in. Becca Halloran had organized the children into a sleeping pile in the warmest corner like a litter of pups, her 2-year-old at the center of it, pink-cheeked and furious and alive. Gus Peterson's oxygen concentrator was useless without power, but Cyrus had found, in his shed, of all things, 2 old welding tanks and a regulator he'd rigged into something that kept the old man breathing. And the 2 of them had spent half the night talking quietly about a war they'd both been too young and too old respectively to have shared. And there's a thing that happens to men in a crisis, where 40 years of barely nodding at each other across a feed store collapses into a friendship in a single night. It was, God help me, almost beautiful. A house full of people who'd have crossed the street to avoid each other in October, breathing one warm breath together while the world outside tried to turn to glass. And into that, at first light, Cyrus stood up by the stove and told them the truth, that he'd done the arithmetic, that the wood in the walls would run out around the 5th day, and that the cold was holding for 6. The room went quiet in that particular way. A room goes quiet when people who have started to feel safe remember they aren't. "There's one more thing in this house that'll burn," Cyrus said, "and it'll get us through. But I need you to hear the whole of it before anybody argues, because I'm going to do it whether you argue or not, and I'd rather we were friends about it." He told them. Front of the house, the kitchen, the living room we were all crowded into, his own bedroom, was the only part he'd never touched. He'd packed the 3 back bedrooms with cordwood, but the front he'd left exactly as Margaret had kept it. The good pine paneling she'd picked out and stained herself. The wide plank floor her father had laid before either of them was born. The cabinets, the trim, the porch and its swing, the bookshelf she'd built, the heavy oak table where she'd rolled out 40 years of pie crust. He'd left it all. He'd been living in the museum of her, sealed and warm, while the back of the house held the wood. "It's seasoned timber, most of it," he said, and his voice was steady, which cost him everything. I could see what it cost him. "Old pine and oak, dry as a bone, 40, 50, 60 years dry. It'll burn hotter and cleaner than the green wood ever did. There's enough of it in these front rooms to keep this stove going 4, 5 more days past the walls. Enough to get every one of you out the other side of this." He paused. "It's the warmest part of the house, and it's the part I built nothing for, and I think now that wasn't an accident. I think I left it for this. I just didn't know it yet." Nobody said anything for a long moment. Then Linda Karchner, Linda, who'd run the meeting, stood up with her cup of broth still in her hands and said, "Cyrus, no, that's Margaret's house. That's all of her you've got left. We'll figure something else. We'll burn the truck, we'll—" "You can't burn a truck in a wood stove, Linda," he said gently. "And there isn't anything else. I know, I counted everything. I've been counting things my whole life." He looked at her and then at all of them and then last at me, and I knew the look was for me because I was the only one who knew what the wood in the walls had really been. A house is just a box that keeps the cold off the people you love. That's all it ever was. Margaret never lived in the wood. She lived in the warm. And there's 26 people in this room right now that I can keep warm, and I'm not going to sit in a museum and let a child freeze so I can keep a kitchen cabinet she touched. His jaw worked once. She'd have had the panel off the wall and in the stove before I finished the sentence. She was braver than me. Always was. This is the one time in my life I get to be as brave as her, and I'm not going to waste it. And that, I have to tell you, that broke the room. There wasn't a dry eye in it, mine included, and I am not a man who weeps easily or admits it when I do. But it wasn't grief exactly that broke us. It was the size of the thing. It was watching a man we'd called crazy, a man we'd nailed a rubber chicken to a fence post over, stand up and offer to burn the last standing temple of his dead wife so that other people's living children could see the spring. We took the house apart that afternoon. There is a particular sound a house makes when you dismantle it to keep people alive, and I'll carry it the rest of my days. We started with the things that came off easy and meant the least: trim, baseboards, a closet door. But seasoned wood goes fast in a hungry stove, and by the second day of it we were into the things that meant something. I was the one who took the bookshelf apart because Cyrus asked me to, and I understood it was a kindness he was doing me, giving me the hard jobs, letting me work off the debt I'd come down that road owing. Margaret had built that shelf. You could see where she'd countersunk the screws a little crooked and filled them and sanded them and been satisfied. I pried it apart joint by joint, and I fed it into the stove, and it burned blue at the edges from the old varnish, and it kept a house full of people warm for about 6 hours, and I thought, this is what a life is. This is what all our careful making comes to, and it is not a tragedy. It is the whole point. The warmth is the point. The shelf was always just stored warmth waiting for the night it was needed. We saved the porch swing for last of the outdoor things, and the oak table for last of all. Cyrus did the table himself. Wouldn't let anyone help. He took it apart on the 4th night while most of the house slept, slow, methodical, unscrewing the legs, and I sat up with him because I couldn't let him do it alone even though he'd asked to, and he didn't send me away. The tabletop was too big for the firebox, so he had to split it, and splitting that table was the only time in the whole ordeal I saw his hands shake. He set them all to the seam of a board Margaret had floured 10,000 times, and he stood there a second with it raised, and he said, not to me, "I'm sorry, Mag. I'm so sorry it took me this long to figure out what it was for." Then he brought them all down. We burned Margaret's table on the 5th night, and it was the hottest fire of the whole siege, that old dense oak throwing heat like a forge, and in its light I looked around the room at 26 sleeping faces. The Halloran baby, Gus Peterson breathing easy, the Voss boy quiet and warm and stable, Linda curled in a corner, all of them alive, all of them warm, all of them dreaming through the worst cold the valley had ever known. And I understood that I was looking at the most beautiful thing money could never buy and comfort could never build. A man's entire grief, transformed, deliberately and lovingly burned down into the simple animal warmth of strangers who would live. The power came back at 4:40 in the morning on the sixth day. I know because I was awake, and the lights came on all at once. The bulb Cyrus hadn't turned off when the grid died, flooding that gutted, blackened, half-dismantled room with sudden electric light. And the furnace I didn't even know he had, an old electric baseboard unit, ticked and hummed and started to push warm air, redundant now, into a house we'd kept alive for 6 days with our own hands and a dead woman's furniture. People stirred. A child asked if it was morning. The radio crackled to life on its own and a voice was saying the cold was breaking. The front was moving east. Crews were restoring power across the 3 counties. The worst was over. The worst was over. And Cyrus Bell sat in his chair by the stove in the electric light, in a house with no walls in the back and no furniture in the front, an old man in a flannel shirt. And he looked around at all the living, and he put his face in his ruined hands, and he wept like I have never seen a man weep. And not one person in that room looked away from him, because by then we all understood exactly what we were watching, and it would have been a sin to look away. The cold broke. Spring came, the way it always does, indifferent to everything that happened in the dark. I'd like to tell you the valley canonized Cyrus Bell, that they put up a plaque, named the road after him, that Dale Suthers stood up at the next Grange meeting and ate every cruel word. Some of that even happened in a small way. There was a write-up in the county paper. People brought casseroles for a while, the way people do, the warm, guilty casseroles of those who realized too late what they had. Becca Halloran named nothing after him, but she named something after him, which is to say her 2-year-old learned to say sigh before she learned to say much else, and would reach for him, and he'd let that baby pull his ruined hands and laugh, and there is no plaque worth 1/10 of that. But here is the truth about that kind of vindication, the truth nobody tells you. And I think it's the truest thing in this whole story. It doesn't undo anything. The valley admiring Cyrus in the spring did not give him back Margaret's table. The casseroles did not rebuild the bookshelf or restore the porch where she'd sat. Being proven right did not return one single thing the being right had cost. He'd burned it all, and it stayed burned. And the warmth it had made was real, and the warmth was gone, the way warmth always goes. And what was left was a gutted house, and an old man, and a valley full of people who finally understood him, about 11 years too late to have done him any good when the understanding might have kept him company. He didn't rebuild the back walls that summer. People offered. The young men who'd called him the woodpecker showed up with trucks and lumber, sheepish, wanting to make it right, and he let them help him close in the back bedrooms, but plain this time. Drywall, fiberglass, the modern way. I asked him why, when we both knew his way was better, when we'd both felt it hold against a cold that killed trees. He thought about it a long time. We were sitting on milk crates where the porch used to be, because he never did rebuild the porch, just left the flat place where it had been and put 2 milk crates there and called it good. Because the wood in the walls was never about the cold, he said finally. Not really. I told everybody it was about the cold. I half believed it myself, but I built it because I couldn't save her and I needed something to do with my hands at 3 in the morning, and packing those walls was a way of being late, over and over, to a thing I was already too late for. It was grief with a maul in its hand. He looked out at the green coming back into the valley. And then 26 people walked into it, and the grief had somewhere to go that wasn't backward. It got used. You don't get to use a thing like that twice. If I packed those walls again, it'd just be a sick man building a tomb. I'd rather have a cold house and a reason to walk down to your place when the wind comes up. I didn't have anything to say to that. I still don't, fully. I just wrote it down that night, the way I write everything down, in the 11th leather notebook, and I've gone back and read it more times than anything else I've ever written. Cyrus Bell died 3 winters later, quietly in his sleep in that plain-walled house, of nothing more dramatic than a heart that had simply done its work and finished. The cold had nothing to do with it. It was a mild night, actually. I want that on the record because it would be too neat, too much like a story, if the cold had taken him, and this isn't a story, this is a thing that happened to people I knew. I was the one who found him. I'd taken to checking on him most mornings. A thing I'd never have done before that winter. A thing I did for 3 years and would have done for 30 more. And the house was quiet and the stove had gone cold and so had he. And he looked, I have to tell you, peaceful, more peaceful than I'd ever seen him in life. And on the milk crate beside his bed where the porch furniture should have been, there was a photograph of Margaret, young, laughing, leaning on a porch swing that no longer existed. I sat with him a while before I called anyone. It seemed rude to hurry. I sat in the warm museum of a man who'd burned his own museum to keep a valley alive, and I thought about all the people who get called crazy, all the ones who see the cold coming while the rest of us are comfortable and laughing, all the ones we point at and nail rubber chickens to fences over because their seeing makes us feel our own not seeing. And I thought, I will never again be quick to laugh at the man everybody's laughing at. I will go and put my hand on his wall. I will find out what he feels that I don't. It cost me a whole winter and a friend I made too late to learn that lesson, and I would not unlearn it for anything in this world. There's a thing I haven't told you, and I'll tell it now at the end, because it's the part that keeps me up some nights and it's the part I think Cyrus would want passed along, if he wanted anything passed along, which he probably didn't. The Arctic cold that came down on us that November, the historic one, the unprecedented one, the kind that breaks loose from where it's never supposed to break loose from, it came back. Not the next year, but the year after Cyrus died, the radio started using those words again. Polar vortex, unprecedented decline, life-threatening, and the year after that. They're not so unprecedented anymore. The old patterns are coming apart, up north where the cold is kept, and more of it is getting loose, more often, and the engineers who built our generators and our propane regulators and our all-electric houses on the Route 6 spur, they built them for a world that is quietly, every year, ceasing to exist. I think we're all going to have to. I think Cyrus saw it. Not the science of it, maybe. He wasn't a man for charts. But he had Margaret's people's knowledge in him, the knowledge of folks who lived where the cold is real and kept, and he had a feel for weather the way the old ones do, geese leaving early and frost 3 weeks ahead, and a wrongness in the air that a comfortable man drives past and a watchful man writes down. He felt the world changing under us before the rest of us would let ourselves feel it, and he did the only thing a man can do with a feeling like that, which is prepare, and be mocked for preparing, and be proven right too late for the being right to be anything but lonely. I've got cordwood in my walls now. The back bedrooms, packed floor to ceiling, oak and hickory, stacked tight and staggered the way he taught me. The young men who helped him drywall his place helped me undrywall mine, and they didn't laugh, not one of them, because they were in that house too, that winter, and they know what the wall is for. Some mornings I walk back there and put my hand flat against it, and it's warm, body warm, alive warm, and I think about a man swinging a sledgehammer at 73 with clear eyes and split knuckles, and I think the warmth in that wall is partly his, stored there, waiting, the way warmth waits in everything we make until the night it's needed.